The darkness that loomed over the Forest of Panic wasn't merely physical, but a tangible manifestation of the terror that dwelled among those ancient trees. For generations, the residents of the small town of Ravenwood avoided venturing into its domain, nurturing legends and stories about the horrors that awaited any soul, brave or foolish enough to challenge its boundaries. Sarah Miller, a skeptical 32-year-old journalist newly arrived in town, considered such stories mere superstitions of an isolated community, products of provincial minds that had never experienced the world beyond those mountains. What Sarah couldn't imagine was that her investigation into local legends would lead her to confront not only the obscure secrets of the forest, but also the demons she herself had carried since childhood, fears she thought she had overcome long ago, buried in the depths of her rational mind. Sarah's arrival in Ravenwood coincided with the disappearance of young Michael Thompson, the local sheriff's son, who had entered the forest on a new moon night after a bet with friends. The official search had been suspended after 2 weeks without results, but whispers about screams heard on subsequent nights and strange lights spotted among the trees kept the community's anguish alive. For Sarah, this was the perfect opportunity for her major investigative report, unraveling the mystery behind the legends of the Forest of Panic and possibly discovering what really happened to Michael. Armed with her recording equipment, a night vision camera, and unwavering determination, she ignored the warnings from local residents, especially those from the enigmatic Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, an elderly woman who claimed to have lost her husband to the forest 50 years earlier, and who, with eyes clouded by time, warned, "The forest doesn't just take, it transforms. What enters never truly comes out the same." On the eve of her expedition, while organizing her equipment in her rented room at the local inn, Sarah received an unexpected visit. Sheriff Thompson, a man of few words and eyes marked by recent suffering, handed her a small object wrapped in a worn cloth. "We found this at the edge of the forest last night," he said with a trembling voice, revealing an antique pocket watch that belonged to his son. The most disturbing aspect, however, was that the watch was completely new, without a single scratch, when it should have been covered with the same mud and debris that marked the spot where it was found. "Something in the forest is playing with us," the sheriff muttered before leaving an unspoken warning hanging in the air. That night, as a storm formed on the horizon, Sarah contemplated the mysterious watch and felt, for the first time, a hesitation in her skepticism. The forest seemed to call to her through the half-open window, the wind whispering secrets she wasn't yet prepared to hear, but which would soon reveal themselves in ways that would challenge everything she believed to be possible. Sarah's first incursion into the Forest of Panic occurred on a seemingly ordinary autumn morning, with the sun timidly filtering through the dense canopy of trees. She had meticulously planned her route, following an old map reluctantly provided by the local librarian, a man with restless eyes who had insisted on marking certain points as areas to be avoided. The journalist advanced confidently, recorder in hand, documenting her observations about the unusually vibrant flora and the disturbing silence that seemed to swallow all natural sounds expected in a forest environment. After 2 hours of walking, Sarah began to notice subtle anomalies. Trees whose trunks seemed to twist slightly when observed from the corner of her eye, shadows that moved in directions contrary to the sun's position, and a growing sensation of being watched by invisible eyes that followed her through the increasingly dense vegetation. The GPS on her cell phone began to malfunction, indicating impossible locations and eventually losing signal completely, leaving her with only her analog compass, which, to her growing discomfort, began to spin erratically. As afternoon began to give way to twilight, Sarah realized she had completely lost her sense of direction. Her efforts to return by the same path resulted in totally unfamiliar landscapes, as if the forest itself was reconfiguring around her. The panic, which until then she had kept under control with her habitual rationality, began to infiltrate her thoughts when she found a perfectly circular clearing where flowers of an intense red grew, unlike any she had ever seen in any botany book. In the center of the clearing, partially covered by these unusual flowers, was a small, worn leather notebook. With trembling hands, Sarah opened it to discover it belonged to Michael Thompson. The pages contained increasingly frantic notes about voices calling from the darkness, time flowing differently in here, and reflections lines that don't correspond to movements. The last entry, written in almost unrecognizable handwriting, simply said, "It's not a forest, it's an entity, and now it knows I'm here." Night fell with an unnatural rapidity, as if darkness was a living entity, swallowing the last vestiges of light. Sarah, now visibly shaken, tried to set up camp, her clumsy hands struggling with the equipment while her eyes constantly scanned the surrounding darkness. The sound of breaking branches at some distance made her heart race, and she directed her flashlight toward the source of the noise, only to glimpse a humanoid figure moving with an unnatural fluidity between the trees. "Michael," she called hesitantly, her voice betraying the fear that now dominated her thoughts. The response came not in words, but in a whisper that seemed to emanate from the forest itself, reverberating inside her mind. "Sarah Miller, finally you've come to us." In that terrifying moment, as the temperature plummeted and a thick fog began to form around her improvised camp, Sarah understood that the legends about the Forest of Panic weren't mere superstitions. Something ancient and conscious inhabited that place, something that now knew her name and somehow inexplicably had been waiting for her. Dawn found Sarah huddled inside her tent, wide eyes fixed on the canvas that fluttered with the supernatural breeze that seemed to carry unintelligible whispers. Michael's diary clutched to her chest. She tried to rationalize the events of the previous night, the figure between the trees, the voice in her mind, the oppressive sensation of being watched from all angles. With the first rays of sunlight, she made a decision that went against all her journalistic instincts, to abandon the investigation and return to the safety of town. However, as she dismantled her camp, Sarah noticed something disturbing. The trail she had followed the day before simply no longer existed. In its place was only dense, untouched vegetation, as if no one had ever passed through there. Her compass continued to spin wildly, and the map in her hand seemed to show topographical features completely different from those she observed around her. The terrible realization hit her like a physical blow. The forest would not allow her to leave so easily. In that moment of despair, Sarah remembered the last words in Michael's diary: "To survive, I must become part of it." Abandoning the idea of immediate escape, Sarah decided to follow Michael's footsteps, using his diary as a guide to understand what was happening. The notes led her deeper into the forest, to an ancient stone structure partially covered by moss and vines, a small temple or altar that seemed to predate the colonization of the region. The inner wall were covered with engraved symbols that seemed to subtly change when not directly observed, and in the center was a small fountain of crystalline water that emitted a faint bluish glow. Against all common sense, guided by a specific passage in the diary that mentioned the water that reveals, Sarah plunged her hands into the fountain. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Images flooded her mind. The history of the forest, a portal between dimensions opened centuries ago by Native Americans in a ritual gone wrong, an ancient entity trapped between worlds, feeding on the fear and memories of those who ventured into its domain. More disturbing still, Sarah saw Michael, not as a victim, but as someone who had made a conscious choice, becoming a guardian, an intermediary between the entity and the outside world. When the vision ended, Sarah staggered backward, her perception of reality fundamentally altered. The forest around her now seemed more alive, pulsing with an energy she could almost touch. The previously imperceptible sounds became clear, conversations between trees, memories trapped in time, echoes of all who had ever lost themselves in that place. A figure emerged from the shadows of the temple. It was Michael, but not completely human. His eyes glowed with the same blue light as the fountain, and his skin had a subtle pattern that resembled the bark of the oldest trees in the forest. "You have a choice to make, Sarah," he said, his voice overlaid by others, older and deeper. "Few are called by the forest. Fewer still are chosen to understand its secret. You can try to escape, like so many others who ended up consumed by fear, or you can accept what the forest offers: knowledge, power, and a purpose greater than any story you could ever write." As the sun began to set again, casting elongated shadows through the ancient temple, Sarah faced the most important decision of her life: to fight against the inexplicable nature of the Forest of Panic, or surrender to its mysteries and become part of something that defied all her previous understanding of reality. 3 months had passed since Sarah Miller disappeared in the Forest of Panic. In the small town of Ravenwood, official searches had been terminated after weeks of fruitless efforts, leaving only theories and speculation among the residents. The room she had rented at the inn remained untouched, her personal belongings carefully preserved by the proprietress, who, unlike the other inhabitants, maintained a strange certainty that the journalist would return one day. Sarah's editor in New York had sent another reporter to investigate her disappearance, but he returned after just 2 days, visibly disturbed, claiming health problems and adamantly refusing to speak about what he had experienced at the forest's edge. Sheriff Thompson, still haunted by his own son's disappearance, began to notice subtle changes in the vegetation surrounding the town. Flowers that had never grown in that region began to appear in gardens and sidewalks, always the same intense red that covered the clearing where Michael's diary had been found. Even more unsettling were the shared dreams that various residents reported, visions of Sarah and Michael walking among impossible trees, their bodies partially merged with the forest, their eyes shining with ancient knowledge. At the forest's edge, where the vegetation was less dense, a small wooden cabin appeared overnight, as if it had always been there. No one remembered its construction, and no one dared approach too closely, especially after the postman's dog returned completely white after investigating the place. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, the elderly woman who had warned Sarah about the dangers of the forest, was the only one who demonstrated enough courage to visit the mysterious structure. The few who saw her return noticed a change in her countenance. The weight of decades of sadness seemed to have been removed from her shoulders, and a serene smile played on her lips. "She's fine," was all the old woman said when questioned, refusing to elaborate, only adding enigmatically that some are consumed by the forest, others become its guardians, but Sarah has become something completely new. In the following weeks, packages began to appear at the doors of certain houses in Ravenwood, small boxes containing personal objects long lost in the forest, accompanied by notes written in handwriting that resembled Sarah's, but with curves and flourishes that recalled the patterns of autumn leaves. At the newspaper office in New York, a manuscript was received by mail with no identified sender. It was a complete account of the true nature of the Forest of Panic, written by Sarah Miller, detailing her transformation and her new understanding of reality. The text defied all conventional logic, describing overlapping dimensions, non-human consciousnesses, and a cosmic balance maintained by guardians such as she had now become. The editor, after reading the manuscript 3 times, decided to file it as unpublishable fiction, unable to process the implications of its authenticity. Only the last page was preserved in his personal archive, a Polaroid photograph showing Sarah at the entrance of the mysterious cabin, her body partially translucent, merging with the surrounding vegetation, a serene smile on her face and eyes that seemed to contain entire universes. On the back of the photo, a simple message: truth is never what it seems. Reality is vaster and stranger than we ever imagined. The forest is not a place of panic, but of transformation for those who are ready to see beyond human limitations. Some call this madness. I call it evolution. One day, when the world is ready, I will tell the whole story. And so, the legend of the Forest of Panic gained a new chapter, and Sarah Miller, the skeptical journalist who came to debunk local superstitions, herself became part of the mystery that will never be fully understood by minds trapped in the conventions of ordinary reality. Years passed, and the small town of Ravenwood experienced a gradual but undeniable transformation. Tourists began to appear, attracted by rumors about the mysterious Forest of Panic and the legend of the journalist who disappeared into its depths. The local economy flourished, with inns, souvenir shops, and guides offering tours to the safe boundaries of the forest, never truly entering it, respecting the silent pact established between the community and the entity that dwelled among the ancient trees. Sheriff Thompson, now retired, became the unofficial guardian of the stories, carefully selecting what to share with curious visitors, protecting the deeper secrets that only local residents understood. The cabin at the forest's edge remained, sometimes visible, sometimes not, depending on the moon, the seasons, and, as some whispered, the mood of the forest itself. Children born after Sarah's disappearance frequently reported dreams where a dark-haired woman with bright eyes guided them along safe paths when they got lost playing near the forest, always leading them back home before nightfall. Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins lived lived to be 103, an extraordinary longevity that many attributed to the regular visits she made to the mysterious cabin. On her deathbed, surrounded by 3 generations of descendants, she finally revealed that her husband had not been taken by the forest as everyone thought. He had made a conscious choice, becoming a guardian decades before Michael Thompson followed the same path. "The forest has always needed intermediaries," she explained with surprising clarity for someone in her final moments. "Humans who understand both worlds and maintain the balance." Sarah went beyond. She not only became a guardian, but a bridge, expanding the forest's consciousness while simultaneously humanizing it. Her last words, whispered to her youngest granddaughter, were, "When the forest calls you, don't be afraid. Panic is just the first test. Those who overcome it discover that what awaits beyond is transformation, not destruction." After her funeral, held at sunset, witnesses reported seeing 3 figures watching from a distance at the forest's edge. A middle-aged woman with bright eyes, a young man with tree bark patterns on his skin, and an older man whom many of the older residents recognized, despite decades having passed. Sarah Miller's manuscript, filed away and forgotten in New York, was rediscovered decades later by a paranormal phenomena researcher who recognized patterns described in the text that aligned with documented anomalies in other ancient forests around the world. What began as a skeptical investigation transformed into a global revelation about the true nature of certain places on Earth, portals, guardians, and entities that existed in the interstices of conventional reality. The Forest of Panic became just one known example of a much broader phenomenon, a case study for a new science that transcended the limitations of materialist thinking. And so, Sarah Miller's legacy finally reached the world beyond Ravenwood, not as a horror story about a disappeared journalist, but as a testament to the courage necessary to embrace the unknown and allow oneself to be transformed by it. For in the end, as Sarah had written in her manuscript, true panic comes not from what we find in the forest, but from what we discover within ourselves when confronted with something that challenges everything we believe to be real. And it is precisely in that moment of disintegration of certainties that we find the opportunity to become something greater than we ever imagined possible.